right, I'm live with John, the Counter Apologist, and he's been on the channel a couple of times, and he's persuaded me for the first time ever live. I'm having a little bit of alcohol. I can't even remember what it was. um, some kind of coffee liqueur or something. But anyways, yeah. So John, you made a. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to share or go over, but you made a video the other day, and you responded to me. Probably the most charitable response video that I've received. But
Oh, that's
anyways.
sweet. Thank you. You're one of you because it was kind of sparked by you and your interest. So I had been going off on the contingency argument here and there on social media, and I would be like, "Haha, Trinity's contingent," and you took it upon yourself to make a video to try and say, "Hey, here's how we could construe the Trinity as not being a brute fact on Christian theism." And I had looked at it and I thought I wanted to respond because I didn't think it worked. And to be fair, your thing was like you didn't think it was completely successful as an argument, but it was like a sketch of an example, I think, of what an argument like that for the necessity of the Trinity would be. And so that kind of sparked me to write a whole thing on the contingency argument and actually put it out there because I hadn't done one yet. So it was kind of sparked. I think you took the initiative there, and it kind of got the ball rolling.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good objection because it's definitely hard to respond to, and obviously a Christian, or at least such as myself, that wants to defend a contingency argument, but can't give up the Trinity, is kind of put in a bind. But yeah, I don't think that. So I don't think we can prove that God is a Trinity. There are some arguments that try to do that, and I don't think that they work. But I think if we can give like a reasonable kind of idea of why God might be a Trinity, then that could show that maybe there's reason to think that it's not a brute fact. So that's what I was trying to do in that video. So I'm just going to respond to what I wrote down as kind of your key objections, and then how I would respond to them, and then I'll see kind of what you think. So just to give kind of a rehash of the arguments. So it kind of follows some idea that we find in Aquinas, but Aquinas, at least from what I could tell, is not very clear. So I don't know exactly what he meant. So I just kind of worked out what he might have meant. But the idea is that I'm imagining God the Father, starts out before generating the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, again, by generating, I don't mean creating. I'm talking about processions, like we read in the Nicene Creed, or like the beginning of John's Gospel talks about like the Word of God, and not all Christians understand that way, but that's okay. So that God the Father starts out, and he's a personal being, so he has an intellect and a will. And the Son, the Word, proceeds from the Father's intellect, and then the Holy Spirit proceeds from the will, which I'm arguing that after the Son proceeds, he then shares the will with the intellect and will with the Father. So then, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And again, I'm not claiming that I can prove that that's the case philosophically, but the idea would be that because God is this unlimited being, that maybe his intellect, by like a metaphysical necessity, has to generate or beget another person, and then his will then begets another person as well. Now, one of your objections was the divine will. I think you said in the video it grows even stronger. So I wasn't sure what you meant by stronger, because I wouldn't say it gets stronger, but I would say the intellect and will source another person. So it's a necessity of being kind of like unconfined. But I wouldn't say it gets stronger. But then, because then you said if God is supposed to be the maximal being, how could its will increase? And then I would say it doesn't increase, but however you want to frame it, I mean, like his intelligence doesn't get greater. It's just that there's this generation, or this emanation of two more persons. And then you said, why does the intellect not increase to birth another person, and so on ad infinitum? And I would say it's just like a symmetry. So the intellect generates one person, the will generates another person. So it and I compared it kind of like a reflection. So it just once, and then I don't see a reason for on and on and on. So, and again, it's not a logical necessity where I can deduce this a priori. It's a metaphysical necessity where I'm saying, like, for all we know, this is just the way the divine nature works. So, what do you think about that?
Okay, so um, I think you've got a good point. There's two parts to the objection that I have, but as you were saying that, and I do remember saying stronger. I went back to my blog because I had transcribed because I had played part of your video in mine and the audio, and you actually did not say it got stronger. That was my misinterpretation because I had written this a long time ago and then recorded it only last week. So I that was a mistake on my part, actually. Thank you for catching it. Um, Now, but I think it could still be said to hold in terms of my objection. So if you were just like, if there's a just say like the intellect reflects upon itself and then the will reflects upon itself. If there's like two mirrors, right, and that they're reflecting upon itself and become so you say it becomes so supreme, right? So I think that's kind of how I interpreted stronger, at least that I believe that's your language. Um, so that like why would it still not become even more supreme? Right? You're like when it reflects upon itself. Like if I have two mirrors and I put something twin it, you kind of get this infinite thing where they just kind of reflect until it gets so small that we can't see it. And so I don't think there's like a principled thing to say, why does it stop reflecting, right? Like I would just kind of get that, camera in a camera looking at itself or a camera looking in a reflection, and it just makes that infinite stretch, right?
Mhm.
So I think like I could rephrase the objection in that way. So like I don't think there's a principled way to say like it sources itself, like by the intellect reflecting upon itself. Why doesn't it just keep going instead of just stopping at one person? So I think that's the first part. I don't know if you want to respond to that before we talk about the more.
Yeah.
I think because
Well,
that's like the
yeah.
minor.
Yeah.
That's the lesser of the two objections, I think.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, the mirror example is just kind of an analogy because obviously, yeah, you hold two mirrors together, you're going to get an infinite or whatever series of mirrors going back, but that's because of the nature of light. But it's more, I'm just thinking about it's kind of like reflecting. So it's like the intellect is so supreme that it has a generation, and then the will is so supreme that it has a generation. But to be clear, I'm not imagining it generating another intellect and will, which then generate another and another and another. Rather, I'm saying the three persons all partake of the same intellect and will, which that's hard to conceptualize, and that's the mystery of the Trinity and such. But that's so yeah, I mean, certainly you could ask why is there not an infinite procession and generation, but at the same time, I don't know that it's implausible that there wouldn't be if we're just talking about metaphysical necessity, that it's more like if I think of an idea and I have like a desire, say, I just have an idea and a desire. It's not like, well, why don't you have an infinite number? It's just like it's just a one to one. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I guess the problem there is that when you say like, so part of this comes down to sort of touches on the second objection I have, but it's more like the intellect. Like I don't want to use reflect because mirror is an analogy, but you're just like the intellect is so supreme it births another person, right? So why does it stop? Like what's your like the will and the intellect are so supreme that they source two people, but then why does it not so supreme that it doesn't just keep making more people? Like does it get exhausted? Like that just seems like an unprincipled thing to stop at just three or like one person per attribute. And like why don't we say this about like God's love is so supreme, right? Because God is supposed to be love. That is another Christian concept. It's in the Bible, right? So why is God's love not so supreme? God's truthfulness is not so supreme, right? So like you can pick like these attributes of God and then say they sourced a person, but then God has a lot of after, if not infinite attributes, but probably like you know, like why would they not then be so supreme that they would then birth another person? And why, if not a bunch of attributes birthing other people, then why would they stop at one? Right? If they're just so supreme, and they could pop out more people, right,
Mhm.
in the same being. why does it stop? It seems arbitrary, just limited to like one each, and then those two principles. Those two, I don't want to call them properties because I think you're a classical theist and that God doesn't have properties and he's simple. But that seems to be sort of a problem to me, or it seems to be arbitrary.
Yeah. Well, I don't mind saying that God has properties as long as later I'm going to try to cash that out to reconcile that with divine simplicity. But yeah, for the sake of making things clear, I'd say God has conceptual properties. So like we can talk about as if he has properties. I would just want to then, but anyways, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, that's its own. Yeah, I'm not trying to bring that up as a problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify for the audience because I've done some discussions on divine simplicity.
Yes.
But anyways, yeah, I mean, I think that you raise a fair concern. I guess my rejoinder would be as long as it's plausibly because like with metaphysical necessity, I think we have a lower bar because it's not an a priori conceptual kind of necessity. Like why can't there be married bachelors? And it's just like you obviously just work it out from the concepts. It's like metaphysical necessity is more like something we discover. I mean, and it's debatable. Like somebody could say there are no metaphysically necessary things, of course, and that might be, your position. But I would say it's at least plausible if we have reason to think that there's a metaphysically necessary thing. Let's just say that it could also have a metaphysically necessary nature that operates in this metaphysical way, necessary way, that we might go, well, why is that? But I think as long as we can tell a story about why it might operate in that way without committing us to an inconsistency, then I think from my perspective, then I've crossed that bar because I guess to me, where God would have brute facts would be if he is in principle unable to explain why he is the way that he is. Now, so if the atheist wants to say, well, the universe is metaphysically necessary, they can. But then where I would kind of push, and that might be okay for this discussion, but if I would want to push back and say, well, but is the universe able to explain like the limits and the limitations that it has in its features? And then that's where I don't know that the universe will be able to do that because it's just already limited. And then if you say, well, it's unlimited, then I'm going to say, well, then I'm end up going to say, well, then you're just describing God. But I'm saying that in principle, God can explain why he's a Trinity. It may not make total sense to our mind, but I think that this model shows if this is metaphysically necessary, then it does serve as an explanation. But another thing to consider is the reason why I don't think the infinite regress objection has as much weight to my mind is I'm not imagining God the Father like spawning a bunch of like little individuals, but it's more like a symmetrical. It's hard to explain, but just again like kind of a 1-to-1. Like he just bursts, like the intellect just has a corresponding generation. The will has a corresponding procession, and then that's it. Like there just is no. It's just a 1-to-1 emanation. But I don't know. What do you think about? I mean, I recognize this is all controversial, and we might have different intuitions. But
So yeah, I guess the biggest thing I'd push back there would be like, well, then all of his other attributes, right? Why don't they do the same thing? But you got to a very interesting part that kind of segues to the second, what I think is the more important of my objections. So the issue here is that you mentioned about metaphysical necessity, and I just think that is particularly problematic as a concept. So let's contrast necessity with contingency. And contingency is just like, well, it seems as if it could have been different, right? And then I just say, if I give you like, what if I wrote out the equation, right, of, quantum field theory, and there's some constants in the various laws of physics, and like the fine tuning argument comes out, and you're just like, they look like it could have been different. Instead of like 0.3 for whatever, it could have been 0.4, right? And it's kind of the same thing on the Trinity. And the problem, I think, with this is that there seems to be things about God that could have been different. But more importantly for the Trinity, right? We're looking at these, we just kind of look at these concepts and these things. We go, well, it could have been different. Well, when you talk about the Trinity, you first have to make a large number of metaphysical assumptions about being and personhood at a minimum in order for the Trinity to not be self-referentially incoherent. And you do that, right? So I'm not going to argue the Trinity is incoherent. You guys make a lot of metaphysical assumptions about, Thomism specifically. They have a schema and all that cool stuff, right? And then it makes it not coherent because you've made a bunch of metaphysical distinctions in these concepts. But now, in addition to those, you are making a bunch of metaphysical assumptions about wills and intellects and the facts that they can source another person in the same being, right? Like that is assumed by your explanation and as a metaphysical principle about intellects and wills. And it sure seems like it's possible that intellects cannot reflect upon themselves and create another being, another person inside the same being, right? So all of these metaphysical principles that are assumed in your schema are very controversial, not even granted by all theists. Only Christians generally take all of these sorts of assumptions, right? And they themselves become brute, right? So, in order to get your explanation, this is why I kind of felt like the Trinity thing is almost like a doomed. It's admirable to take on to attempt to do this, but I think it's ultimately doomed conceptually because you have to propose a bunch of metaphysical principles that then explain why God is a Trinity, but then why are those the metaphysical principles that are then necessary? They have to be necessary if God is necessary for God to necessarily be a Trinity, right? To avoid all this. So then you have to have, well, these metaphysical principles are necessary. Well, but they seem like they could have been different. Why is that? Well, then if you could make another set, like the infinite regress kind of comes out, and like you're trying to explain why these metaphysical principles holds rather than their contradictory like propositions, and you just get a whole bunch of brute facts by
Yeah.
having to kind of explain this from the start.
So, yeah, the one point I wanted to focus on, you had said it sounded like you were saying, well, you could imagine it or conceive it going a different way, and I agree with that. Um, but to me, that would only be a problem if I was arguing a kind of strict logical necessity, like all squares have four sides, or all bachelors or unmarried, where it just like has to conceptually follow. But like I would say, conceivability doesn't entail metaphysical necessity or metaphysical possibility. Like you could imagine something, but then you kind of have to work out whether you find it plausible that it's metaphysically necessary or not. And that's where, when I'm thinking about like a necessary foundation, I'm more thinking about, in principle, could it explain its features? Not necessarily, can I imagine a possible world where this doesn't hold? Yeah, I mean, I agree. I can imagine a possible world where God doesn't exist, but I don't think that's actually a metaphysically possible world. I think it's just a strictly logical possible world. So I can imagine a possible world where God's not a Trinity, but I don't think it's actually metaphysically possible. So what do you think about that?
So I think this boils down to what is ultimately a problem with metaphysics in general, right? There's no limiting principle in terms of what you could deem metaphysically possible or impossible other than showing a logical contradiction in it, right? So there's this fundamental thing where you go, well, I think this principle holds, and it's like, well, if you're saying that, if you're saying that, well, this principle holds and is necessary, but it seems like it could be different, right? Well, then why what the universe, like I could the atheist could just, like I said, this I described it as like drawing a neat little circle around what seemed to be contingent uh properties, excuse me, and then calling it necessary arbitrary, being very arbitrary in what you call necessary, and then the atheist can just go, oh, yeah, the naturalist even can just be like, well, I'm just going to draw a circle around the laws of nature as we best understand them mathematically, and that's necessary, right? And so I don't really see, like I think this becomes a problem for metaphysical necessity, and I think it's sourced with the general problem of metaphysics, in that there's no schema that we can use to rule out what is and isn't metaphysically possible or impossible beyond logical laws, and that underdetermines the metaphysical landscape to a ridiculous degree.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it comes down to what ground somebody has for thinking that there's a necessary being or necessary foundation. Because I would say, like, well, maybe that's the best explanation for why anything exists. So then like if that's granted, then I can say, okay, so in principle, could this metaphysically necessary foundation explain why it exists and has the features that it can? And as long as in principle it can explain that, then I think it's good to go. It doesn't have to cross the higher bar of logical necessity because it's not logically necessarily. I could
Certainly.
imagine it not being that way. But so it then comes down to, does somebody think they have good reasons for thinking there is a metaphysically necessary foundation, which of course is going to get into different arguments. But go ahead.
So I guess the real you intrigued me with something you said there, and it's just like, well, this explain why it exists, right? As the necessary being, and I go, well, that's the like what seems to do the work there, at least in terms of my understanding, is the concept of necessity, right? That's like its own thing. It's like, well, this exists necessarily, so it just has to be this way and always exists in all possible worlds. And by calling it necessary, you just sort of rule out all the logical spaces where it doesn't exist or has a different property or something like that. And I don't like that's what does the work of explaining why it exists. Like the atheist, the new atheist goes, well, what created God, right? And you go, well, God exists necessarily, and it's like, well, that doesn't tell me anything, right? I could just say the universe exists necessarily, or matter energy exists necessarily, or something along those lines, right? So I don't see what does the work there.
Yeah. Well, right, yeah, and in principle, yeah, the naturalist or atheist could say that matter, energy, or the universe are metaphysically necessary, but then where I would push back on is, okay, but can that necessary, its a necessary nature then explain why it has the features that it has, and I don't know that it's going to be able to I mean, you could give a story, but I don't know if it's going to be able to plausibly do that because it's already starting out with these limitations. While if we have an unlimited foundation, I'm going to say it doesn't have to then explain why it's limited because it's just a singular unlimited foundation. It exists due to its necessary nature.
So I mean, like you're like, oh well, it has these limits because it has these contingent properties of an equation. But then it's just like, well, is God your God limited because he's three persons and not n, right? For any natural number, is God your God limited because he's loving and not hateful, right? Which is the second objection I had of brute facts that are
Yeah.
supposedly exist
Well,
about
let's.
God.
Yeah.
So like that seems to be the sort of problem when you go. It just seems like there's this, if you're just drawing this circle around it, like what explanation is there for why God is a trinity? Well, I appeal to these metaphysical principles about intellects and wills sourcing themselves, or sourcing another person. Well, then why is that the metaphysical principle and the way the reality behaves, right? Because the metaphysical principle just describes how reality behaves, and then, well, that sure seems like it could be different. So you're just kind of pushing the brute fact into the schema almost, if you do that, right? And so it feels like to me that some you're going to have bruteness somewhere. Like everybody's stuck with it. I don't see, given um like just the logical laws, and to be honest, and this is pretty controversial and weird, I'm not even sure about the logic of the metaphysical necessity of the classical logical laws, even, or mathematics, because you can have different. There are paraconsistent logics. There are different logics that have been used in applications to solve problems, right? Real problems, that were successful, and there are different mathematics using different axioms, and a lot of them are just useless things. But like, what makes our logic the necessary logic? Could it not itself be contingent given the whole possibility of all of the different paraconsistent logics that we have, right? So like even that seems almost contingent to me, right? I mean, we just kind of say logic and math are necessary because that's the way our mind works and that's the way reality works. But as someone who would be sympathetic towards naturalism, even though I don't identify as one, the logical laws really kind of become like the laws of nature in that they describe how material reality behaves. At least that's my conception of what the laws of logic are. And it seems like that could have been different, right? Like, at least conceptually, knowing about other logics that come from different axioms. So I'm just very I'm modally skeptic, so to say, about this whole concept of necessity in and of itself. Like you're just granting a lot of stuff. I see the comment there. That's pretty good. I've triggered all the Bayesians.
Yeah. Well, I would say with like, I mean, it could be that there are different types of logics that and maths that could apply in different situations. I know there are different systems, but I guess a lot of people, including myself, have this deep intuition that, yeah, there's just certain principles that just seem like they just have to apply out of logical or mathematical necessity, like the law of non-contradiction. At least when I know there are some weird paradoxes, but at least when applied to like a concrete thing, like I don't think I could exist and fail to exist at the same time. It just seems so incoherent that I'm just gonna put my chips on that one, even though I recognize it's an assumption, but it's just a deep intuition that I have. But maybe we should go on though to because you're kind of touching on your other point about God being loving and that, and maybe that will help us flesh this out some more. So I know you had said in the video, why is God's nature loving rather than hateful, or truthful rather than deceptive? If theists give a reason for this, and they must appeal to something outside God's nature for why these things are good, and so must give up the moral argument. So, as we talked about before, I'm not big on like Craig's or whoever deductive moral arguments, so I don't think that those really work. But I do think that moral truths are necessary, but we could still ask, why is God this moral way instead of another moral way? And I'm going to say it again. It's given his metaphysical, his nature. Now, Apologetic Squared notes that at times I've said that God is hateful towards sin. And yeah, I do think that that is a plausible. I kind of go back and forth on whether we should say that's literally the case, but certainly I don't think God is hateful towards people, although I know some theists might say that. But
Them
yeah,
Calvinists, though.
right. So I would say, yeah, I would say again, it's metaphysical necessity. I'm going to say God, being an unlimited being is by necessity. I'm going to say has empathy, and he has justice, and those are just going to flow from his nature. And again, metaphysical necessity. So I find it satisfying, but I understand, it's going to be one of those things where you're going to have an intuition, whether that's going to be a brute fact or whether you think that can meet that bar of metaphysical necessity. But anyways, what are your thoughts there?
So this just seems to me important caveat, and I actually got a comment on my video about this too. They were like, "Why are you saying God's nature must ground the good?" And I'm like, "This is an objection that is aimed at people who defend the idea that God's nature is the ontological ground of moral values, or more specifically, the good." Right? So it's a one or the other. Right? It's not all theists who hold this. So obviously, yourself, you don't necessarily hold to it. Um, Now, when you say, well, God is metaphysically necessary, it just seems intuitive that he must be loving. Well, again, that's kind of my objection. It seems like you're picking out all of these things that we sort of value. We value being loving, we value being truthful, right? And I think that's because of the brute facts of our evolutionary biology and history. We value these things. And then so I think theists are kind of projecting that onto God. And it feels like you're taking the things that we just value and you're drawing a little circle around it and you're going, that's necessary, right? Because it's intuitive to you that it's necessary. But I don't see any way you can say that it is so. And if you try to tell me a reason, so this is sort of like it's one of my favorite objections to the Craig style of moral argument. And you give the Euthyphro dilemma, and is are things good because God commands it, or are does God command it because they're good? And he says, well, God's nature is good, so that's the way out of the dilemma. And when you pose the Euthyphro dilemma again to the person who espouses this sort of view, you say, well, is something in God's nature because it's good, or is it good because it's in God's nature? They take the second horn. They say something is good because it is in God's nature. They don't appeal to reasons outside of God's nature as to why he is loving or good, or loving or truthful or just. There's a whole variety of attributes here. And so when you say that those attributes are good because they're in God's nature, well, you've just drawn a circle around a bunch of attributes and called them. You said, well, it's in God's nature, and he doesn't have the converse, and it's that way because he's metaphysically necessary. So it's again the same sort of objection that I'm trying to come out at. was it with the Trinity example?
Yeah, and just kind of reiterate, I would say so in the kind of the scheme that I'm working with, which I grant somebody can push back on, but it's that I'm trying to ground that God's necessary because of his nature, but then he's um, because he's the necessary foundation, he's gonna and metaphysically necessary, he's gonna lack limitations, and it's because of those because what I'm arguing is that limitations are a mark of contingency, because we can wonder, well, why those limitations and not others? And then if that's at least if that's granted, then I'm gonna argue, well, then he's going to have the attribute of empathy or an attribute of justice, and those are going to then give him this moral character. And again, you can push back on that and say, well, that doesn't seem plausible to you or whatever, but that's just to explain kind of where I'm coming from on that.
Right. So like when you kind of what I really don't like is when you go, well, is I mean, ultimately we're stuck with what you find plausible. I'm not calling you unreasonable for being a theist. I'm not calling you unreasonable for believing in a Trinity or believing that your God is love, right? But when you go, well, it just seems plausible to me, and then you tell me I have an explanation and you don't have one because these attributes being somehow necessary rather than other attributes, um, like that kind of undermines the contingency argument to me, at least, right? When you go, well, a naturalist don't have any explanation, and therefore you can't know anything, as Ed Fazer likes to say, when to accept a brute fact, and it's just like, well, look, if you accept the moral argument in this kind of grounding of the good, well, these things become brute unless you just draw a circle around some attributes and call it necessary and go, well, it's plausible that they're necessary. It's kind of the same thing with the Trinity.
Yeah, so I want to be clear that I'm not endorsing the view that naturalists can't know anything, or even that
Sure.
naturalists can't give an explanation. It's just when I'm thinking about, okay, if, and I'm not saying you grant this, but if somebody grants that they find that there's a metaphysically necessary, foundation to reality to explain, why why the universe exists and reality exists, and they think that a metaphysically necessary foundation is the best explanation for that, then I'm saying that it does seem pretty plausible to my mind. And again, yeah, obviously we're working off of intuitions, which I recognize people can have reasonable disagreement over, but that this necessary foundation is going to lack limitations unless those limitations require other limitations. So yeah, I think God is limited from being made out of wood, because he'd have to be spatially limited in order to then be made out of wood. But as long as it's not what I'm calling a second order limitation like that, where it's parasitic on another limitation, that he's going to lack limits at that foundational level. And then I'm arguing that from there you can get these other attributes. Now, I grant you and somebody else, people can reasonably disagree on that, but that's just to explain my thought process. But go ahead and push
Right.
back, and then I got a question for you from the chat.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's that much more to really
Okay.
say there. Like what on like limitations. Like, well, if you say, well, God is necessarily loving, like that alone just seems kind of weird to me. And I use this in other examples, like, well, God is not libertarianly free, which will parlay into the third discussion. Um, but the idea that God is necessarily loving, so God necessarily loves whatever He creates, right? Well, that certainly seems limited. God can't create something He doesn't like, right? Like that seems I've created things I don't like, maybe not intentionally, but I'm sure I could make a painting that I know I'd hate just to make a painting that I know I'd hate, right? Or something along those lines. Like I could just do that, and you're like, well, God can't. Well, that seems kind of like I could do things God can't, right? So like I could sin and God can't sin. So like when you say limitations, I'm sure that's probably a lot more metaphysically weighty, and there's a lot more in your schema behind that. But then it just again, where it feels like we're pushing all the bruteness over into the schema, right? And it just part of my thing here is I'm not just attacking Christians or theological things. I'm kind of trying to point out the idea that everybody's going to be stuck with some kind of bruteness. And the one quote I really like from Ed Fazer is like, bruteness is sort of like being pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant and you can't be a little bit brute. And once you got a little bit of bruteness in you, the whole necessity thing goes out the window.
Yeah, since you talked about free will, we'll go ahead and move that into that in a second. So this is flowing nicely. But I got a question from the chat from Apologetic Squared. If classical logic can be true in one world but not another, is it metaphysically possible that classical logic holds for one moment but not another? So
I'm very dubious about what metaphysically possible means, and say, well, if it wasn't metaphysically possible, right? And then you would say, well, then are there these other worlds? And you get into all sorts of kinds of questions about like modal logic and modal of modality itself, right? And there are some really strange views about modality. It's like famous in philosophy about these really weird views about what it would be, what it means to say that there's another world that, like just this the like quantum field theory's equation is different, right? Or force doesn't equal mass times acceleration, which I know is a generalization, but you get the idea, right? Like, do these worlds exist? Right? Like, if you tell me that to pick a contingent thing, the laws of nature are a great example, and it's like, well, you tell me is there a world where the sky is pink because the refraction of light behaves differently through our atmosphere, right? So I don't see, like, once the world exists, it sort of brutally is that way, and that's the way the world is. Or you could even say that over a certain period of time, that these things that seem constant to us on this small time scale that we've been around change. Okay, so what if it isn't that they're holding all the time? They're just holding for a limited period of time, right? When you say one moment, but not another, well, how long is a moment? Which is its own fun metaphysical question, right? But like in after 3 billion years, and we're all dead because the sun expanded and engulfed the Earth, and we never got interplanetary travel working right, right? And then suddenly, like the laws of physics shift slightly because they change over time. hmm You would never know. We're limited beings, right? I don't think we're going to understand that, and I think the best explanation for it is because we're evolved.
all right. Excuse me. Okay, so then the next part was, or the final um, objection that you raised, you said, why did God choose to create? And it leads to a modal collapse. And I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but humans give reasons for their preferences based on their biology and evolution. So it seemed like you were saying, like, um, if God creates for a necessary reason, then that leads to, him creating out of necessity, which a theist, probably want to avoid. But also it seemed like you were saying that, um, for our choices, we can give a kind of history based on desires and evolution and such. Now, if that's what you were meaning, what I would say is like I think God does act based on, I don't know if I want to say desires in the sense of that, because I could apply a kind of like neediness of God, but I want to say, God has something like interests or things that he's interested in. Now, again, not every theist will maybe agree with that, but that's going to give a kind of explanation. So he's interested in creating others so they can partake of, his loving nature, and so on. And I'll give a whole, Christian narrative on that. So yeah, I would want to model God's. I would want to say God has free will like we do, but because he doesn't have impulses of malice or impulses, towards greediness and so on, he's not going to have any interest in doing evil things. That's where I'm going to try to argue that there is an explanation within his nature why he can't will evil, even though he still has free will for non-moral decisions. So what do you think about that?
Right. So I love to point on the fact that God does not have free will with respect to moral decisions. But that's its own separate argument that we can go over. Like, not today, but it's a separate argument. But the idea being that, well, when you so first things first, shout out to Joe Schmid, Majesty of Reason channel, who has this awesome paper. Kid's like half my age and is like brilliant philosophically. And he talks about the fruitful death of modal collapse, right? Where he talks about, so one of the classic objections to the principle of sufficient reason and the contingency argument is that, well, if God has reasons for acting this way and he's a necessary being, he has those reasons in all possible worlds, and therefore everything becomes necessary. Nothing's contingent, right? And so when you point to a libertarian free choice to make physical beings, just to create the physical world instead of just making us pure spiritual beings, right? An individual, just immaterial minds that somehow interact with each other, right? But theists grant we have to be able to do anyway. Um, like that itself is a contingent fact. It has to be. And then why God chose to do that. And you're like, well, the best I think a theist can say, and Joe covers this, is to say God has non-necessitating reasons why, right? So it's a reason, but it's not a necessitating reason why he chose that. So you get down into this fundamental objection about libertarian free will. And so I go to the like, says libertarian free will is very controversial in itself. And so what one of the classic objections to it is that if it's libertarianly free and you say, well, God just chose to do X rather than Y, well, that's no really different than a random number generator, right? If I was to say, why did the random number generator pick 3 instead of 4 at any given call of the random number generator? Well, you just say, well, it's a random number generator, right? And you say, well, why did God pick X over Y when he could have picked either? And you go, well, God just chose that as an explanation. Well, that doesn't really seem to me like an explanation other than you say, well, we accept, like when I say I chose to have whiskey for my drink tonight rather than beer, and you, you say, well, I just chose that. Well, in that case, I lean towards determinism, and I'm against libertarian free will. I kind of say, well, I have preferences towards whiskey over beer at this age in my life, and that explains why I was happy on the poll. People chose whiskey over beer in terms of what I would drink tonight, and I can appeal to those biological reasons of my necessity or the biological reasons for my choices and preferences. But you can't give me a reason why God preferred physical things versus purely spiritual things. God had to choose that. Otherwise, you end up starting to say that God has a necessitating reason to create physical things. So when you get to these, basically what I'm saying is that libertarian free will choices, if libertarian free will can be said to be real, seem to themselves be a kind of brute fact. And that you're stuck with calling them brute facts because there can be no explanation other than, well, he just chose it. And if you consider the possible worlds where God chose to make the sky pink instead of blue because he changed the way light refracts, then and you say the same, you give me the same explanation. You say, well, God chose to make it that way. That's not really an explanation to me, right? If even when you appeal to my free choices, supposedly free choices, right? All that really does, if it truly is libertarianly free, then it just seems to be something that like assigns it at least assigns why I made a choice in a certain way or not. It's not there to kind of explain the choice. You can't give me an explanation why I chose it. It was just free. And that seems to me equivalent to a brute fact.
So, just so I can understand, are you saying that libertarian free will in general is committed to brute facts? Or are you saying that only in God's case would it be, or especially in God's case? Or
No, so I think libertarian free will, if it exists and is coherent, would be committed to any libertarianly free choice would have to be a brute fact, right?
okay.
And so, as such, like God, like I have reasons. So my example was like, there's a reason I prefer chocolate to whatever rotting meat tastes like, because we evolved to be repulsed by rotting meat because rotting meat makes us sick and die, right? Whereas chocolate has a bunch of properties with calories and sweetness that we like, and so it tastes good to us, whereas the other thing is repulsive, right? So I have an explanation in my biology as to why I like one versus the other. I have certain preferences. And if I was to have a libertarian free choice of what to eat every time I'm picking the chocolate and not the thing, and I think this is going towards an argument towards determinism, but let's pretend that I have a libertarian free choice. It just has to be a brute fact. There's nothing that's making an explanation there to say, oh, it was libertarianly free. He just chose that. Well, how is that different than a brute fact? I just don't see any libertarian free choice seems like it has to be a brute fact to me. There's no explanation in principle other than that's what I happen to will.
Yeah. So yeah, I do hear that objection a lot from people. So I would say and as far as I could tell, other defenders of libertarian free will argue this as well, that the agent explains the choice. So, why did I, choose to, get on Twitter today? It's like, well, I am interested in that, and maybe those interests are caused by impulses that I didn't have control over, but I still think there's like a range of which I can freely select, and then it comes down to, well, why did I select, to do X and not do Y? And the explanation just is that that's just what I will, but it's not outside of my control. If it was outside of my control, it would be like this random impulse. So it would be like a random number generator. But since I think because I'm under control over the action, I thereby explain it. So like, why did I log on to my computer? Well, it's just because I willed it. But the reason why I willed it is enough of an explanation because I'm in control of my action. Now I understand determinists may not like that, but to me that I don't see a problem with that. But what do you think about that?
Right. So I think that that's its own fun debate about free will versus determinism and whether or not the agent counts as an explanation or not versus to make it different. That is what makes libertarian free will different from randomness, right? And whether or not I agree with that is immaterial to this objection because, right, it's not an explanation to me for me to tell you, for like you say, I could have chosen beer or whiskey. I chose whiskey. And let's say it was a libertarian free choice and my prior determinants had no impact on this. It was a libertarian free decision, but I could have chosen whiskey or could have chosen beer. And let's pretend I did. There's a possible world where I chose to have beer tonight. There's to give the same explanation in both scenarios to contradictory choices doesn't explain anything. That's not an explanation if the same explanation gives me different outcomes. Right? That seems to me to be a brute fact. It appears to me to be a contingent fact of what I drank tonight. I'm drinking, but the thing is that that's contingent, and that why I chose one over the other, there's no reason for it other than that's what I just willed. And even if I say that the agent is a explanation for it, it's the same explanation in either counterfactual, and I don't accept that the same explanation giving me contradictory results counts as an explanation.
So is because I know you said we're kind of avoiding it's not a debate over or discussion over libertarian free will, but like to me though is that because to me that seems to be the objection with like the modal collapse is just it doesn't make sense for God to have libertarian free will. But if somebody grants that like libertarian free will, at least in the agent causal sense, is coherent, then it does seem like that avoids modal collapse to my mind.
It avoids the modal collapse. I agree, but I'm saying that all the libertarian free choices are now brute facts. There's no explanation for why he chose it over the other. Why did God will one thing over the other? That's a contingent fact, and there's no explanation for it other than, well, that's just what he willed.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's just where there's just going to be, a disagreement where again, it's going to come down to intuition that I think if an agent is in control of their decision making, they may be on the receiving end of impulses, but why they went with one impulse rather than another, I think is going to be self-explained by they just have control over what impulses they choose to pursue. But that's where it's going to come
Yeah,
down
but
to whether you
why did
find
they?
that.
But so the question becomes, why do they choose one or the other? Forget impulses. Pretend there's no impulses. Why did he choose one over the other? He just chose it. That's brute.
Yeah, I
There's
don't know that it's brute in the sense it's contingent. That's not explained by necessity, but I think that something is a brute fact when it's a contingency that has no explanation. But I think in this case, there is an explanation. The explanation is that the agent willed themselves to do that. If you say, well, why? That was the stopping point. The agent freely willed themselves to do it. Like there just is no more. If we were to go more, then yeah, determinism would be true. But um, it comes
so
down to whether,
that just seems to me like it's moving brute facts into the schema of a free choice, I don't see a difference between, well, like we're like, well, that's just the stopping point. Well, the question of like, well, why is the universe have, why is the current equation we know of quantum field theory true as versus a slightly different equation? It's like, well, it just is. That's what a brute fact is. So you just go, well, it just is that. That's where it ends. At some point, the explanation, the quest of an explanation, ends somewhere, and it seems to end somewhere arbitrary. And if it's a arbitrary free choice of an agent to pick one over the other, it doesn't really seem any different to me than it just saying, well, it just is that way versus another,
Yeah.
right?
Well, the difference with so the difference with like the quantum, and I'm open to the idea that quantum indeterminacy is a brute fact. I don't think that would necessarily undermine a contingency argument, but that's another discussion. But the
Right, right.
reason why I think that that would be a brute fact, though, is because the quantum indeterminacy isn't able to account for why it operates in one way as opposed to another. But I think if an agent is in control over their decision making, they are able to explain why they act in one way over another. They have control over their decision making. They aren't under control by something else or just acting out of control spontaneously like a quantum particle. So that's where I would see that there is explanation. Now, again, I know determinists don't necessarily like that, but
It's
that's
it's
just
not
kind of
that
where
it's not that I'm saying determinism has to be true. I'm just saying that when you go between these two different things, and the will is in control, and God could have willed otherwise, and it not have conflicted with His nature. There's no explanation why He willed one over the other. There can't be on the libertarian free will. It's just like, well, that's what He willed, and I don't
yeah,
see how that's what He willed is any different from that's just the way it is.
yeah,
Like I don't see what's added explanation wise. It seems equivalent to me. Now, again, what is that? That's that dirty intuition thing again, and we're going to disagree there. But
yeah,
so, I mean, that's kind of why I'm putting, all of these discussions and arguments are kind of putting our intuitions out there and seeing what people find more plausible. That's
right,
ultimately kind of what we're doing. And so that's my take on it. I just don't see a difference between those two propositions.
yeah, yeah. And to me, it's that principle of, or at least what I'm imagining, is self-control is where you can get um, a contingency. I think can be self-explained by an agent that has self-control. But yeah, as you said, it's going to come down to if you find that plausible. Okay, we do have a question though. Are you saying indeterministic causation and libertarian free will are necessarily brute facts that seem obviously false and contradictory, or are you saying it's explanatorily meaningless? Um,
I'm not so, so I would think indeterministic causation and libertarian free will, like the outcome of libertarian free will or the outcome of an indeterministic cause, um, would be brute. Like it seems like that. I'm not saying that if libertarian free will is a brute fact that libertarian free will exists. I'm not sure if that's what he meant. Um, So it seems like they're equivalent, and I don't think I think it is explanatorily meaningless to say that God chose X over Y when either choice would not have violated his nature and it was free and he could freely choose one or the other. And if I say, well, God, why is X? And you go, well, God chose X, freely chose X. And and then we go in the other world and we go, why did he choose Y? And you go, he just freely chose Y. You've given me the same explanation for contradictory results. And we don't like, at least I'm an engineer by trade. And when you give me the same explanation for contradictory results, that's not an explanation by definition. If the same explanation could cause both things, um, other than it being like a random thing itself, a random cause or an indeterministic cause, I don't see how it is an explanation. Like why I can't consistently get one result or the other.
well, and in fairness, I mean, libertarian free will defenders would say libertarian freedom, is an indeterministic explanation. But I think maybe what you mean is that that would amount to like a random or
Yeah,
brute fact, right?
Yeah, so what I was kind of using the libertarian free will and the deterministic cause interchangeably, just from that's what the question that he asked. So, if I have a bug and I go, why did I get this value and it caused the application to crash? And I go, well, it was because he called this API, and it was just like, but I called the API in this other instance, and all the other constants were the same, and and the application didn't crash. And you go, well, that can't be the explanation for why the application crashed, right? So maybe I'm being too computer engineering right now, but in my world, you can't if the same explanation gives me if the same explanation is given for contradictory results, then either the explanation is indeterminate and doesn't really explain why I got that specific result, or it's not an explanation, right?
All right, yeah. Well, those were the points that I picked out from your video. I think we hit them. So the Trinity, um, God's nature being loving rather than hateful, truthful rather than deceptive, and then why did God choose to create? So I kind of hit, the responses that I wanted to lay out for my own thinking. Is there anything else though that you wanted to share on this? I think we made some good progress.
No, I think we got it all. I was really, I think, like you said, it kind of comes down to this. All these discussions always come down to what you find intuitive, right? And what you feel plausible. And if you say, well, I feel it is explanatory that a libertarian free will choosing X over Y is a valid stopping point, and I just go, well, it just is brute. Why X over Y happens to be what is actual, and that's fine. Both of them seem to be libertarian free will seems to be kind of the place where everything I would kind of call a brute fact is where you'd put it. You kind of file it in. Almost all of them seem to fall in the libertarian free choice, the schema. Like that's where the theistic schema goes, and I'm questioning whether or not that really is an explanation. And then the other thing was questioning the nature of necessity, metaphysical necessity, and how you put bounds around it. And so I think that itself is questionable. And the metaphysical principles that you're assuming, those all seem to have to be necessary, but they sure seem like they could be different. And to me, it seems like you're drawing a circle or what seem to be contingent things, why reality behaves this way. And you're drawing a circle around the ones you like, and you go, that's necessary because it seems intuitive to me that it has to be that way. And if you want to say that, okay. But then if you tell me, well, you don't have an explanation for the way the world is, and I do, and it's, well, I don't really think you have a good explanation there, right? So it's kind of, I'm more against the contingency argument as an argument against atheism than I am about like, well, I kind of think this is necessary, right? Like I could kind of grant that, but it does seem to me to be kind of arbitrary.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would definitely recommend, people listen to John's video and check out his channel and then of course watch my videos as well. But all right, well, we're
Absolutely.
at an hour, so I'll have you on again sometime, but this will probably be a good stopping point time wise. So
Yep.
all right. Well, I thank everybody for watching and have a good night.
Thanks for having me.